Hello again everyone, I'm Dennis, welcome back to the Bindery. In today's video, we're going to finally finish this deluxe rebinding of Dune. To get started today, I want to work on upgrading these plain functional endbands that I sewed onto the book in part 2. For that, I'll be following the instructions in this book called Headbands and How to Work Them. The style I'll be attempting is called a Germanic braided headband, which is a structure that was regionally common in the late Middle Ages. I've been practicing these off camera, and I've made some annotations right in the book to help me remember the things that I learned on the way. I will say right now that these are probably the most challenging endbands that I've tackled to date, and so this isn't going to be a tutorial. Instead, just wish me luck and hopefully these will turn out okay. Thankfully, the materials and tools I'll need for this structure are pretty straightforward. My main tool is going to be a sharp awl, and I'll also need 2 blunt needles with wide eyes that I'll use to weave this leather lacing. I tried a couple of different ways to cut these laces, but in the end I found that using scissors to cut around a circular piece of leather was the most consistent. This is the same leather as I used for the bookmark, so everything's going to match. With the book held securely, I'll roughly measure out about 4 feet of lacing. In my practice runs, I found that it takes a lot more lacing than you would think, and I don't want to run out partway through. To attach the lace to the needles, I trim the ends to a point so that I can slip it through the eye of the needle. This may not look particularly secure, but when put under tension the lace will bind against the eye of the needle and it's surprisingly strong. I'll also give a light coating of beeswax to the leather to help it pull through the holes a little bit easier. To begin, I need to pierce a hole through the leather on the edge of the spine just below the structural headband. And yes, jabbing a dirty big hole into something I've put so much effort into is more than a little bit terrifying. But I've just got to commit to it and work carefully. I push the awl through the leather a fair distance because I need a fairly large hole to accept the leather lacing. This leaves plenty of room to pass the needle through, and at this stage, drawing the leather lace through is pretty straightforward as well, though that'll change pretty quickly as the weaving gets going, which you'll see in a moment. With the lace pulled through to the halfway point, I bring the other end through the same hole from the other side. With 2 double thicknesses of lacing passing through this hole now, it's gotten pretty tight. The authors of the book recommend using a pair of needle nose pliers to help pull the leather lace through, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Apologies for getting my hands in the way of your view, but pulling like this puts a lot of strain onto the leather here, so I want to hold things in place to make sure I don't do any damage. Once that's successfully pulled through, I'll take up the slack, leaving a small loop. With that first loop established, I now pierce the second hole to the right of the first one, with a space roughly equivalent to the width of the lacing. The biggest challenge, well, one of the many challenges in weaving this endband, is achieving the correct tension. It's a fine balance between pulling everything tight as you go and leaving enough space to actually work the weave. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. And this is where things start to get pretty complicated. The weave has to go back through previous loops and around again to the outside. It's really easy to get things flipped around with the lacing turned inside out, or going under where it's supposed to be over, or over where it's supposed to be under. You get what I mean. As I said before, I'm not trying to show you how to do this endband, because I barely understand how to do it myself. Eventually, after 4 or 5 repetitions, I start to get a feel for the pattern and develop a rhythm, and things go fairly smoothly after that. As you can see, the leather lacing is completely covering the structural endband that's underneath. And as I work on this, I realize why the German bookbinders of the late Middle Ages used this structure. It ties the text block and the cover physically together, thus adding an incredible amount of strength to the part of the book that's subject to the greatest amount of wear. And of course, I think it looks particularly cool, fitting in especially well with the style that I've given to this binding. When I get to the other end, I go back and refer to the instructions once again to remind myself how to do the finishing wraps. Basically speaking, the last few loops get tucked in underneath previous wraps to secure them, and then I simply trim them off using a small pair of scissors. Well, that went about as well as I could have hoped, and seeing it on the book now, I'm really glad that I went to the effort to learn this style of endband. I think it looks really good. Now I just need to do the other one, and hopefully that'll turn out just as well or better. With the end bands done, the covering of this book is now structurally complete, but I've got quite a lot more work to do to execute my full vision for this binding. I've spent I don't know how many hours working on my design for the tooling for the cover, and I've gone through a lot of different iterations, but this is the one that I finally settled on. I've drawn it out full size on paper, and then I used some thin tracing paper over top to copy the design. The reason for that is so I can take the tracing paper and lay it on top of the binding itself to work through to transfer the design before moving on to the full tooling. To impress my design into the leather, I'm going to be using a variety of brass finishing tools, some of which I've made myself, but more on those in a little bit. Now I'll take my tracing paper and cut out the individual panels for the back cover, the edge flap, and the front flap. To make sure that these are positioned properly and don't move around, I'm going to use a little bit of low-tack painter's tape to lightly attach them to the leather. As you can see, my design takes advantage of the fold-over cover and follows around the entire outside of the book. Cutting out the circle on the front flap template will help me to align it accurately. One of the main tools I'm going to be using is this brass stylus that I made. It's got a narrow curved tip that in practice is held much like a pen. Using a strip of bookboard as a straight edge, I use the stylus to work directly through the tracing paper, going over the lines of my design to leave a faint impression in the leather underneath. For these defined curves, I switch over to these professionally made finishing tools called gouges. I have an incomplete set of these in a variety of sizes, and I was careful to use only the ones that I had in creating the design. Where the stylus really shows its worth is in these free-form sand dune elements. Holding it just like a pen, I can trace over the gentle curves onto the leather. I work my way over the cover, making final decisions on the tooling as I go. I chose to leave out some of these sun rays that were part of the initial design, for example, but in other places I feel that there's something lacking, so I'll work in other elements to those areas later. But the real benefit of working through the tracing paper is that it allows me to accurately transfer my design onto the book. And this technique will even work with these more intricate tools as well. I'm going to use these to fill in larger areas with more of a textured pattern, which I laid out in a simple grid on the paper. They leave just enough of an impression for me to see where I need to go over later. Once the basic pattern has been established, I use my little hot plate to warm the tools to make the final impressions. Using heated tools will ensure that the impressions I make will not only be clear and crisp, but dark and also permanent. I had to experiment a little bit with temperatures because this leather has proven to be fairly unusual in that it tools at a much lower temperature than what I'm accustomed to. In fact, I found the ideal temperature was about as if I'd left the tools sitting out in the sun. Just warm to the touch, but not quite uncomfortable. I found at this temperature the tools would make a clear, dark impression. At higher temperatures, they had a tendency to stick to the leather, which of course is not ideal. As before, I start with the straight lines to establish the edges of the design, and then I move on to the curves and more detailed tools. I recently acquired this particular tool, which I really wanted to incorporate into the design, but I felt that it needed a little something extra to finish off the ends of the pattern. So I headed down to the workshop to make a finial tool that matches up pretty well with the existing pattern. As I work, I keep my original design handy as a reference, so that I can keep track of the pattern once I've moved beyond the basic layout on the tracing paper. And here you can see why I like this particular tool, because by making multiple impressions end to end, the pattern repeats, creating a really pleasing sort of bas-relief design. Once I finish working on the back surface of the cover, I can turn my attention to the spine, following the same process to impress my design into the panels between the raised bands. It's finally time for me to turn my attention to the front cover of the book. And for this, I've decided to go all in with, you guessed it, a sandworm. Sandworms are at the heart of Dune, and since the aesthetic I'm going for is really reflective of the Fremen, I really had no choice but to incorporate Shai Hulud into the design. I'll use the same techniques as before to transfer the design onto the cover, and again the tracing paper template comes in handy, this time to lay out the book's title accurately as well. To tool the sandworm, I'm going to try an additional technique. As I was doing some tests for this project, I discovered that this leather could be compressed and polished to a dark chestnut color. So that's what I want to do to the background around my sandworm to really make it stand out. I started this off just using my stylus, but I found the results to be less than satisfactory, so I quickly popped down to the shop to make this polishing tool. The teardrop-shaped sole works really well for working around the tight spaces, and it does a good job of smoothing the surface. You may have noticed that I left the front edge of the front flap here blank, but I did that deliberately because I want the design to line up between the two surfaces. And with the front cover tooled, I can now work on finishing up the flap design so that all the different elements come together perfectly. I also take the time to extend the tooling around the corners so that the design wraps all the way around the entire book. With my original paper design fully achieved, I can now use some of my other tools to fill in some elements. I found that working on paper I could only use so much creativity, but now with the book almost fully realized, I can use my artistic license to continue developing the design until I'm happy with it. There are some areas that I chose to leave essentially blank for the time being, partially because I didn't want to overdo it. But also, if in the future I decide I want to make some additions, I'll have room to do that. There is one more feature that I've wanted to incorporate into the tooling from the very start though, and that's to incorporate some Fremen glyphs along this line in the pattern. To do that, I'm going to be following this Jacobsa script that was developed for the most recent films. I of course don't have any custom tools for this script, so that means that I'm going to have to form each character individually using my stylus. And if you're wondering what this script says but you can't read Jacobsa, maybe check the link up at the top of your screen. With that, the tooling is all done, which is a big milestone in achieving my vision for this book. But I'm not quite there yet. There are 2 more things I really want to do to truly elevate this binding, and for the first one, I need to prepare the leather in stages. I'll first apply a paste wash, which is a diluted version of the same wheat paste that I use to attach the leather to the book. This will help to seal the pores in the leather, which will create a smooth surface for the final decoration. And yes, I'm aware that water is bad for sandworms, but in this case, I think it'll be okay. Once the paste wash is dry, I continue the surface prep by adding a layer of gelatin to the tooled areas that I want to highlight. Once the gelatin has dried, I then apply 2 coats of a substance called glaire, which is basically just refined egg white, and is the critical element for the type of decoration that I'll be doing. I apply the glaire over the dried gelatin layer onto the tooled areas that I'll be working on. And finally, it's time for me to let you in on what I've been hinting at, which you may have already guessed, and that is genuine gold leaf. Gold leaf is not only an extremely traditional decorative material for books, but one that I think would definitely be in use in the distant future of Arrakis. This is genuine 24 karat gold, and is less than a micron thick, so it's extremely delicate and difficult to work with. Using my knife, I'll cut the gold to size, which will also make it easier to handle. I'll use a thin coat of Vaseline on the leather to ensure that the gold stays put while I'm working on it. To pick up the gold, I use a piece of cotton wool which I've rubbed on my forehead. The tiny amount of natural oil from my skin is enough for the gold to stick to, allowing me to pick it up. I can then press it in place, the gold sticking more to the Vaseline than the cotton wool, thereby transferring it. In this way, I'll apply enough of the gold to cover all the areas that I want to work on. Once I've applied all the gold, I'll go over all the impressions that I made earlier with the same tools, only this time I've heated them to a higher temperature. I rock the tool left, right, up and down to ensure that I've made full contact, while the heat of the tool sets the glaire, permanently bonding the gold to the leather. When done correctly, the impressed gold surfaces should have a mirror shine, which really catches the light. Once I've gone over all the tooling, I need to remove the excess gold, and to do this I'll use this gold rubber, which is made of natural crepe that's been softened with paraffin oil. By rubbing it gently over the surface of the leather, it will pick up any of the gold leaf that hasn't stuck. This not only cleans up the excess gold, but traps it as well so it can be recovered later. Gold may not be as valuable as spice, but it's still pretty expensive stuff. The rubber will also pick up the gold from areas where it should have stuck but didn't, and these I can go over again by applying more glaire and more gold, then retooling. This is only the second book I've ever done with gold after all, so I never expected it to turn out perfectly on the first try. The gold rubber does a good job of picking up most of the excess leaf, but to clear up any last stray bits, I wipe the cover using lighter fluid, which also removes any of the remaining Vaseline. So we've done the tooling, we've done the gold, but there's still that conspicuous blank circle that you've been wondering about. Let me show you what I've made to go there. If you don't recognize what this is, it's an engraving of the map of Arrakis, more specifically the northern polar region. You may remember seeing this briefly way back in part 1 of the series. I've made it to fit perfectly into the recess on the front flap, and to hold it in place I made this engraved bezel to go around the perimeter. The bezel has recesses that line up with the 6 slots you can see on the map, which will allow me to use these copper cleats I made to hold the entire thing in place. This map though is just a backdrop, but first let's take a quick sideline for me to show you how I made it. Behind the scenes I've been practicing hand engraving, and I've finally gotten to the point where I felt I could take on this design. Using a sharp graver and a small hammer, I carved my designs into the surface of the brass. The process is fairly easy to explain, but much harder to execute. Once the engraving is done, I cut out the pieces, clean them up with files and sandpaper before doing a final patina treatment to achieve the desired look. And of course, the real centerpiece here is another sandworm. Just as the worms dominate the world of Arrakis, my sandworm goes over top of the map of Dune, symbolically encompassing the entire world. And because the coming and going of Shai-Hulud is so important to the Fremen, this effigy will turn and pivot on a central point, a reflection of its dominion over the desert. To attach the medallion, I first need to pierce some holes in the flap. To do that, I'm going to use this narrow chisel. First, I mark the leather through the piercings in the medallion itself, and then with that removed, I push the chisel all the way through the cover, making enough room for my copper tabs to pass through to the other side. I then put the bezel in place and push in the tabs. The bend points on the ends will hold the bezel and the base plate in place. Inside, I trim the tabs to length using a block of wood as a gauge. Then mark and cut some shallow recesses into the inside of the flap to allow the metal tabs to be bent down flat. Using the back of my hammer, I'll tap the tabs down. And while this may look fairly extreme, my intent is to create a tight clinch on the tabs to hold the medallion firmly in place. Or at least that's what I had intended. So I'm having a ton of trouble trying to get these cleats to stay flat. I think I've made an error in the way I folded them in. These inner tabs are folded opposite the way the outside ones are, and I think what I need to do is to fold these over in the opposite direction so that they pinch together, rather than this sort of seesaw effect. That means I'm going to have to patch these holes that I made, but that's not too much of a problem. I didn't catch it on film, but when I bent the tabs over in the other direction, I actually broke one because the metal had become fatigued. So off camera, I took them back down to the shop, heat treated them to soften them, and then made a replacement for the broken one. I'm glad I did all that though, because the tabs are now really secure and below the surface of the inside of the flap, so they won't show through once they're covered. To make the hole for this central pin that will hold down the sandworm, I'll use my hand drill to make a small hole through to the other side. And then I'll put the sandworm in place with the small copper pin that I made. That too gets bent over on the inside into a corresponding recess. Finally, I'll use some small bits of gray board cut to size and glued in place to fill in the recesses. When those are dry, I trim away the excess with my paring knife and then sand the inside of the cover flap smooth. And now, at long last, we've come to the final stage of this binding, and that's attaching the marbled papers that I made way back in episode 2. I've kept them aside for just this moment, as well as a third piece which I'll use to cover the 2 panels on the inside of the cover flap. Separated end papers like these are called doublures, and I wanted to make sure that they have a nice even border of leather around all 4 sides. So I'll make a template first for each one. This way I'll be able to make sure my marbled papers are cut precisely to size. I can't afford to make a mistake on those after all. And here's another thing I've been waiting for quite a while, and that's unwrapping the text block of the book. I need to be able to see the papers on the inside to make sure that the patterns line up, and it's nice to see that the book is still there after all this time. Once I've got the marbled papers aligned where I want them, I'll fold up the edges around the template, which will effectively mark where I need to cut them to size. I'll do that for all 4 pieces before pasting them out. Here I'm using wheat starch paste, which is the same adhesive that I used for the repairs in part 1. So while we watch me get those end papers pasted in place, I'll take a moment just to say thanks to everyone who's followed along with this series from the beginning. This is a project I've wanted to take on for a very long time, and I'm glad that I've been able to share it with all of you. The feedback I've gotten on this binding so far has been nothing short of amazing, and so thank you to everyone who's commented on and liked the videos, and of course subscribed to the channel. And of course a very special thank you to all the contributors who have supported me directly either through PayPal or by buying me a coffee. Your generosity has gone a long way in making this project possible. I am, after all, a one-man show here, not only the bookbinder, but also the cameraman, video editor, and every other job that goes into producing these videos, so I really do appreciate that extra support. If contributing to the channel sounds like something you might like to do, you can find links on how to do so down in the video description. Now, it looks like I've got those end papers all done, so it's just a matter of weighing them down to dry, and in the morning, we'll get to see how this book has finally turned out. So there it is, my version of Dune finally completed. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I hope you are too. It's been an incredible journey and I've learned a lot, so thank you for joining me and sharing in the experience. I think now I'm going to sit down and reread this book. So until next time, I'm Dennis, and I'll see you in the next video.